That's great. Fantastic to be here. Anyway, by these days, most people know who to expect when I come, just in case anyone was expecting the other Kate Middleton. But, you know, I don't get so much disappointment when I travel to places these days. But I'll tell you a little bit about me for those of you who don't know. So I work with a church in Hitchin in Hertfordshire. Anyone from Hertfordshire? No. Very quiet. Okay. Well, that's where I'm from. But I'm also currently I have the world's craziest commute because at the moment I'm living in Paris in France. So, yeah, I know, yeah. We're just there for 2 years while my husband's on a placement and we're coming back this summer. So I'm working with a church, but I also work with an organisation called Mind and Soul. We're a national organisation, and our passion is about encouraging the church to engage with matters of emotional and mental health. So there's a team of us working there. We're all about you guys on the front line trying to support you, resource you, and encourage you with the stuff that you're coming across. I've got 2 kids. I've got a little boy who's 3, and I have a girl who's 10. So I'm kind of at the 2 ends of this zone. I've got the toddler tantrums, and we're just starting to hit well, not the teenage thing because she's 10, but those of you who have kids of that age will know that that is actually teenage now. So I have those 2 things going on. So it's quite interesting. This morning, what I want to think about a little bit is what's going on in our kids' minds and our teenagers' minds, whether it's your kids at home or whether it's the kids and young people that you're working with. So give me a wave. How many people have got kids and young people at home? Lots of us. And so as well as those, you've got the ones you're working with, which is very brave to have 2 sets of kids and young people you're working with. Which are easier, the ones at home or no, don't answer that. That's too complicated. So what I'm going to do is just talk you through a little bit of the storms and the challenges right through. I'm going to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour this morning. My background is that I'm a psychologist, so I'm interested in how the brain is actually working, how it's developing. And I find that very often understanding a little bit of what's going on in the minds of your young people and your children helps you a lot in terms of what you're practically dealing with, just day to day, some of the challenges that we have with them. So that's what we're going to do, because the process of developing from a child to an adult is a gradual one. It doesn't happen overnight. So if we looked at my little boy, who's 3, we would not expect him to react to the world in the same way that I would as an adult. We wouldn't expect him to react in the same way that my daughter does, who's 10. But at some point, both of them are going to have to start to take on an adult way of interacting with the world. But it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. And there are gradual changes that go on right throughout the age range, which affect the way that they're able to cope with things, the particular challenges that they have with what life is throwing at them. Add to that they live in a culture now, particularly as they get into sort of secondary school age, which is throwing all sorts of challenges at them day in, day out, which very often they're going to struggle to cope with just because of where their brains are at. So if you think about the way that your brain develops, there are 3, this is a bit basic, but there are basically 3 levels to your brain. You can see at the bottom of this slide the sort of the pink and the red zone. That's the sort of base bit of your brain. So it handles the really basic day-to-day stuff, the breathing, your heartbeat, stuff like that. Above that, where the orange arrow is what's called the limbic system. Now, this is the part of your brain that controls all of your sort of basic emotions. So things like fear, anger, the very instinctive sort of gut-based emotions that you have. Then on the top, you've got all the wavy bit, which is the clever bit of your brain. It's the bit that does all the thinking, the analysis. It's very, very complex. And that's really where the more complicated social emotions that we as humans have, that's where they have their seat. So the special thing about humans, if you like, over a lot of the animal world is that we have this extra complex layer. We see the world in different ways. We interact with the world in different ways. And we have an emotional experience that is different as well. And biblically, we know that we're made in the image of God. If you look at the Bible, you'll see very similar emotions there in the experience of God, but also when Jesus is on the earth. You'll see a similar range of emotions. So our emotions are not just something basic about the way we're designed. There's something that's about us reflecting the nature of God. And a lot of that's to do with that top extra level of your brain. Interestingly, here are 2 scans of babies' brains. Now, the one on this side is actually a prem baby. This is a baby that was born to about 26 weeks. And you can see really clearly the line of that top bit of their brain is much less complex than the adult brain. The one on the other side is a baby of nearly term. That's a baby of about 36 weeks. So you can see the difference just between the prem baby and term, but still that one of the term baby is not as complex as the adult brain. And young children, are born with a brain that is still developing. It's one of the unusual things about humans that our children are born with their brains not fully developed. So when they're born, when they're very young, when they're in the zone that my son is hopefully just coming to the end of, it's all about their brains catching up with them because they were born not quite fully developed in that sense. This is just one of the many nerve fibers that you find in your brain. There are millions of these in your brains, 100 billion in an adult brain of these neurons. In children, they have the same number, roughly, of the actual cells, but they're not really very connected. It's all a bit of a jumble, it's all quite random and chaotic. So what you see throughout childhood, this early childhood zone that my son is in, is rapid connections forming all the time. Synapses is what we psychologists call the official connections between two nerve cells. And there's a point at about 2 years old where they're forming almost 2 million per second. It's phenomenal, the level of complexity that their brains are developing. They are literally sponges. They're soaking up the world around them. They are learning every single second. One of my son's favorite TV programs, the theme tune says, "Every day is an adventure." Anyone with I can tell now who has toddlers because they're all singing the rest of the theme tune now. But that's what it's like for a toddler. Every day is new. There is not a second when they're not learning. Then we get to a stage during adolescence, which is very interesting. So the brain is a bit more stable between roughly about 3.5, up to maybe about 7, 8-ish. But then we hit this second phase. And we used to think that the brain really, that your developing was done in childhood and then it was pretty stable. But once we got better at scanning the brain and we developed the technology to do MRIs and PET scans and things like that, what we discovered is just how active your brain is in that second phase of adolescence. And in adolescence, what you're looking at is then a lot more fine-tuning and pruning of these connections. So you're taking a child who has got a pretty good ability just to interact, but it's not very refined, and they're going to struggle with some of their fine-tuning, some of the control of some of the things in their brain. And you're gradually turning them into a more adult, more mature brain. They're more able to interact and cope with the world the way that we do. But it takes time, and particularly in the front part of their brains here, which controls particularly important abilities, things like these more complex social emotions, things like motivation, things like control and impulse control. And there's things that we'll talk about later that are specific to that. And there's a massive amount of change going on in teenage brains in these areas. So what we're talking about in adolescence is not just kids who are learning in some kind of surface way how to interact with the world, but they're very, very real developmental changes going on in their brains. If you think about the children, what's interesting is just how shaped they are by the world they grow up in. So babies are not grown fully developed. This is a quote from a study that was done by Harvard University saying that as young children develop, their early emotional experiences literally become embedded in the architecture of their brains. They literally are what they experience. The emotional health, therefore, of young children is very closely tied to the social and emotional characteristics of the environments they live in. They literally are what they experience. We are shaping their brains at that stage. If you think of Trivial Pursuit, people play Trivial Pursuit? You know the little games pieces? You've got your little plastic sort of piece of cheese holder. It's a bit like early childhood forms the mold for the holder. And then in adolescence, we're putting in the pieces of cheese that complete the model. But so childhood is very key. It's about forming the basic structure of what they understand about the world. What we know and what we've discovered is just how crucial this is. These are some more brain scans. And you can see here the normal scan of a normal 3-year-old, comparing that to a child who's experienced extreme neglect. And the impact that this is having on their brain is stark, isn't it? We're seeing a child who hasn't had enough stimulation to be able to develop all those connections in their brain. And we're seeing a really obvious difference there. Now, these sorts of changes aren't necessarily permanent, But it's really interesting to think about just the extreme biological and physical impact that some of these things are having on young children. And some of you may work in environments or in communities where you're seeing kids who are having perhaps not this extreme an experience, because this is really extreme, but who have grown up in an environment that may have given them some genuine challenges in terms of what they've learned and what they've experienced in their very early emotional life. So what I want to talk to you about in this first session is I'm going to give you 3 sets of 5 things which I think are useful to know. And the first 5 that I want to look at is thinking about this younger age group. So those of you who are living with or working with younger kids. So I'm talking kids from my son's age, but also up to the beginnings of early adolescence, so the sort of primary age group. And I'm going to want to think about what are the things that these kids, because of the way their brains are developing, what are the things that they still find challenging? What are the things about the way they see the world that are different to how we see the world? When I work with a kid, my first job is to try and get inside their head and understand how they see and understand the world that they're living in, because it's different to how I see it. When you think of your own experiences as a child, you've got to realize that your experience and your understanding of them as a child was very different to how you look back at them now as an adult, because as a child you see the world in a totally different way. So here's number 1 of how kids see the world, and this is that kids are basically very what we call egocentric. So they believe very much that the world revolves around them. I know that you probably know quite a few adults who also believe that. But this is like a basic brain belief. They are not cognitively able to see the world from other people's perspectives. Theirs is the only camera view that they see on the world. They find it very hard to think about how other people experience things. So when you're trying to talk to them saying about how they make you feel, that is very hard for a child to understand, because basically their experiences of their worldview. They get better at it as they get older. And one of the things you'll see in young children, those of you who've got them, is the ability to lie, which is one of the first signs that we realize that they've started to be able to understand that I have a different perspective on the world to them. So this is a picture from this great study where they put the kids in a room with a chocolate cake, and then they leave a cover over it, and the experimenter leaves the room and says, now you mustn't touch the chocolate cake, but I'll be back in 10 minutes or something. And they go out and they leave the kids who are between about 3 and 4. And when they come back in, they say to the kids, "Did you touch the chocolate cake?" And the little boy who's touched it is just, "No, I haven't been anywhere near it. I definitely haven't touched it." And it's just great if you watch the video because he's covered in chocolate. This is the ability to lie, because they've learned that we don't know, we weren't there. We don't know if they touched the chocolate cake or not, so they can get away with it. It's worth a try. So we in our household at the moment, because my son's 3, he's quite good at this now, we have a lot of it wasn't me. It was Leah, that's his sister. No, she did it. I did not touch that. I did definitely not break that. So this shows that they've started to learn this ability, and it changes their perspective then on life, because they start to be able to do things like empathize. They start to get better at thinking about how the world seems for someone else, but it's still quite a naive appreciation of it, and their basic instinct is to see it from their perspective. Where do you see that most? Quite often in their understanding of cause and effect, which we'll look at in a minute. Their basic default is to assume that everything happens because of them. So if you come home and you've had a lousy day at work and you're in a bad mood, it must be because of them. They're not able to think, "Oh yes, but you've been out at work all day." Because their perspective is the only one, they're going to have a default that they assume things are because of them, good or bad. Which is why young kids who've gone through difficult experiences often benefit from some work that helps them to understand that it probably wasn't anything to do with them, that sometimes things are going on at home that have nothing to do with them. It's not their fault, it's just the way that things are, because their default is to see it that way. This is number 2. This is to do with the way that kids focus on things. So attention, those of you who've got toddlers will know, is not something that they're born with. Particularly some kids. My son has thankfully just started to get better at this, but it wasn't so long ago that he couldn't focus on anything for longer than about 3 seconds before he had to move on to the next thing, and he just ricocheted around from things. That was his day. As they get older, they get better at focusing their attention on something. But there's a whole range. Some kids struggle at moving their attention, so they get so absorbed in things that they then find it very difficult to move away and focus on something else. This ability to move your focus of attention from one thing to another, back to another, is something that they have to learn. And ultimately, kids really learn that the fastest when they start school. That's what those early days of school are all about, trying to get them to sit down and listen to a story for 10 minutes and just gradually get better at sitting and focusing on one thing. But at first, kids find that very difficult. So if you've ever tried to talk to a child while they're watching their favorite TV program, you might as well not be there because they're totally absorbed in that moment. They're not able to flick across to you. They find that much harder than adults do. As they start to get better at flicking their attention around, you see an impact on things. So things like problem solving, they get much better at that. They can start to think about things and analyze things in much better ways. Once you're seeing kids in school, they're going to be much better at thinking and about some of the problems and the tasks they're set in school. And again, you'll see the stuff that they're taught in school as they go up in the classes starts to develop these skills. So that first skill that we talked about in seeing the world from different perspectives, you'll see as they go up in school that they start to get asked to do things that are about, writing as though you were the person in the story and things like that. So the challenges that they're doing in school are all very much in line with the general theories of how their brains are developing. Here's number 3. This is one about cause and effect. So young children, they like to believe that the world is very simplistic and that it is very predictable. And they need to believe this. It's part of their emotional health requires them to live in a world that's very predictable, that's not too alarming. For their security and in order for them to feel secure, they like to have this fairly clear cause and effect. So things that are very unpredictable, very difficult to understand, are very frightening for a small child, which is why they don't like loud noises. Fireworks are a classic one, because they're difficult to predict and they're difficult to understand. They like things that are much more cause and effect. It's why they're obsessed in toddlerhood with things that they do that make things happen, like turning on and off light switches or things like that, because it calms them. It's a very comforting thing to see that something that they do has an immediate effect. But again, this is the way that they see the world. They're instinctively linking things that are happening in the world around them to a cause, to something usually because of their worldview that they've done. So they're very instinctive about that. And this is why children find very difficult parents or family environments where there is, for whatever reason, inconsistency. So it may be that somebody's ill, that there's nothing you can do about it, but one of mum or dad is not well and things have become a bit unpredictable or difficult. That's very hard for young children. They don't like that. It may be that there's a parent at home who struggles with temper or with violent outbursts. That's really hard for a child because they need things to be consistent. And children living in those environments, trying to bring the world back into their sort of controllable cause and effect form, will try to control it. They'll try to act in ways that make it more predictable, even if predictable is bad. So some children you'll see will get into a place where they deliberately misbehave in order to trigger a response. Some of that's about their need for attention, but some of that is about cause and effect. Because even though that's bad in terms of the outcome for them, at least they understand it, they expect it, and therefore that's comfortable for them. So this cause and effect instinct is quite a key one, particularly in young children. It gets a bit less so as they get older. But the impact of some of those things can carry on throughout their life. They are not, however, very good at generalizing rules, right the way up to when they get into this early adolescence. So if you tell them off for kicking a football about in one room, it's quite likely they might pick up the football, take it to the next room and kick it about in there. And to you as an adult, it's really obvious that rule that you were imposing on them is a general one. Please don't kick it round in the house. But to them, these two rooms are totally different contexts. So again, what children are looking for is consistency from the individual adults who are around them, but also from the spread of adults who work with them. So it's much harder for them if one adult says they can do something and another one says they can't. So children flourish generally under situations where their rule structure is quite consistent and quite predictable. They don't like it, they might push against it, but actually they're gaining a comfort and a security from the fact that those rules are consistent. Some kids directly challenge your consistency. If you tell them off for something, you'll see them immediately go and challenge it. You tell them not to touch it, the minute your back's turned, they'll have gone to touch it just to see what happens. And again, although they don't like being told off for it, there is actually a comfort and an emotional security in the fact that your response is consistent. Here's number 4. This is to do with the ability to think in abstract ways and to understand abstract concepts in the world around you. So some things about the world around kids are solid, they're obvious, they understand them. That chair is hard, that pan is hot. They can understand those concepts very directly, but there are a lot of things that we talk about that are much less obvious, less easy to get hold of. So an obvious abstract concept would be that of time. Little kids have no concept of time whatsoever. If you say to them, we have to go out in 5 minutes, this means nothing to them. It's just an abstract thing. They haven't linked it to any solid thing. If I say to my daughter, we need to go in 5 minutes, she knows what that means. My son, not a clue. So when they're thinking about abstract stuff for young children, they genuinely don't have the cognitive ability yet to comprehend what that means. Which is why if you've got young children, these will very soon become your best friend. Because what star charts do is they turn an abstract concept that we would like them to understand into a very solid reality. So we transform little things that we need them to do in order to help us with our day, like get their shoes on in time to go to school, into a really solid, understandable thing. You will get a star if you do this. That's why star charts work so well. They're all about helping them to cope with this bit of their brain that isn't so good. Is an interesting thing to think about, therefore, in how they understand their emotional world. Because emotions are actually quite an abstract concept. Understanding how all these weird things that we feel and make us want to act in particular ways, understanding what these are, putting names to them, starting to understand a bit more about the sorts of situations that make us feel that way, understanding what we do in those circumstances in order to feel better, understanding how to control those things so that we don't do things that irritate or get us shouted at by the adults around us. They're all quite abstract, quite difficult things. And one of our jobs as significant adults in our young children's lives is to help them get better at that. So to be quite deliberate about putting a name to some of these things. So with my son, I will talk a lot to him about things like, this is making you angry. Are you feeling angry? Are you feeling frustrated? And I say, and actually helping him to link the feelings he's having physically with what we would call that emotional situation. So that as they get older, they get better at understanding that what they're feeling is anger and it's likely to have this impact on them. But if they do this thing, it might make it feel a bit better. That's a developing path towards emotional maturity, which takes them their entire childhood and adolescent time. And actually, I work with an awful lot of adults who've never quite managed to get to the end of that journey because it's hard, it's not easy to learn about emotions, and if you don't have clear feedback when you're a child, if you don't have someone who helps you to learn those things, it can be quite hard as an adult to learn them, and we'll talk a bit more about that when we think about adolescence. Here's number 5, and this is really a key one for children because of what happens in this next stage in adolescence, and this is to do with your self-concept. It's another very abstract thing, that concept of who am I? It requires the ability to understand that I am different from another person, that my experience of the world is different from this person. So it develops from around 2-3 years old and right the way through. So if you look at younger children, they won't use their own name, because they don't really understand that they're a separate person from the rest of the world. Till usually around 2, they'll start doing that. It depends on the child. Girls tend to be quicker than boys. But then they'll start using their own name. And even then, they'll talk about it in quite abstract terms. So they'll talk about, well, my son went through a phase, Nathan is doing this. Nathan is going to take this over there. Nathan is going to have a drink now. He was talking about himself in quite a separate way. And then you hit the phase more towards the end of the 2 years, which like those of you who've had kids will definitely remember, which is where suddenly they get this strong sense of them. And everything becomes mine. This is my iPad. This is my drink. Everything in your entire world becomes owned by them. And they feel they have an ownership over everything. And this is their very naive, young way of expressing this powerful sense that they've just realized they're a separate person. And from then on, you'll see them learning about that and becoming more sophisticated in how they understand that. So young children don't even understand at first that the reflection they see in a mirror is them. They'll talk about the other baby in the mirror, and they'll think it's hilarious. By the time they get older, they know when they see photos, they know it's them, and they understand that. But they still struggle. If I show my son pictures of him as a baby, he gets quite cross. I'm not a baby. It can't be me, because I'm Nathan. I'm not a baby. He doesn't quite understand yet that he is this changeable, developing person, that he was that baby, that he will be this older boy in the future. When he sees pictures of his sister when she was a baby, he thinks I've gone totally nuts. How can that be Leah? She's a big girl. She's not a baby. He doesn't quite get it yet. When they start to form this self-concept, that's then their chances for the early levels of what we would talk about as self-esteem to come from. So what he is learning is lots of stuff about what it means to be Nathan. Who is he? When he hears things from other adults, he's learning. Remember, this brain, totally sponge-like, is soaking up loads of information about what it means to be Nathan. So is he a good boy generally? Is he a bad boy? Is he funny? Is he clever? Is he good at art? Is he good at running? All these messages kids at this age are picking up like a sponge because they're starting to form, remember, that outside structure of what will become their self-esteem, the concept of themselves, their understanding of who they are, of who they were created, what's their place in the world. So it's just the naive structure of it, but it's starting to become really significant. And we'll talk again a bit later about some of the impact that can have on these kids when they grow up and start to become adolescents. Because if they don't get the things that they need to form that structure well in childhood, then they can hit some issues when they hit adolescence, and suddenly everything's up for grabs and everything changes and they have to understand a lot more about who they are. In kids, meanwhile, this age is such fun because their self-concept is still forming. It's totally up for grabs. So this is why kids of this age, actually usually my son can't stand it, but most kids love dressing up. Because when they put on a costume, when they put the Scooby-Doo costume on, they're not just a kid wearing a Scooby-Doo costume. They are Scooby-Doo. They have become that character. Imagine a world that is that exciting. If you put on the superhero costume, you actually are that superhero. Again, some of the guys are like, well, I still do that. Yeah. I am that superhero. But for kids, they really are. There are great studies where they get kids and they give them a box to play with, and the kids, you know how they are, they'll turn it into a train or a boat or whatever. And then they take them to one side and say, what actually is that? Is it a train or is it a cardboard box? And the kids are totally panicked by this question because it's just, but it can be both for them, because this whole sense of playing and reality, it's all still up for grabs, that who they are is totally up for grabs. It's why we see in kids that if they experience trauma, they're able to retreat physically, in terms of in their mind, from it, because their sense of who they are is still totally up for grabs. So things can literally be happening to someone else. And it's a childish instinct to do what we call dissociate in that way, to almost separate themselves from what's going on around them. This is one of my favorite studies of all time, which I always share when I'm talking about this. This is a study of their understanding of reality to kids in this age group. And this is a study where they ask kids aged from about 3 up to about 9 and 10 about their understandings of what was and wasn't real. Now, before I understand this study, I know there's some babies. Are there any older children in the room? Just wave if you have an older child. No. Slightly old. In the room with you? Not listening. That's fine. Because I'm going to talk about a significant figure in children's lives, that being Father Christmas. So you have to be very careful about that. So this study asked the kids if a couple of key people were real or not, okay? And they asked the kids about Father Christmas, and they asked the kids about the bin man, okay? This is at age 3. 70% of the 3-year-olds in this study believed that Father Christmas was real. 78 of them thought the bin man was real. So I love this. A quarter of 3-year-olds are not sure if the bin man is real or not. This, to me, explains why my son is so excited when the bin man comes, because to him, it is as exciting as if a dragon had just walked down our streets. Because real and mythical is totally up to grabs for him. This is just an exciting thing that happens. As they get older, we see their understanding of what's real and what isn't changes. The peak for Father Christmas, by the way, is about 5. At 5 years old, almost all of them are fairly convinced that Father Christmas is real. Obviously, and slightly reassuringly, their belief in the bin man does go up too. By 9 years old, 98% of them, I'm slightly concerned about the remaining 2%, but the 98% of them are convinced that the bin man is real. Any bin men who are in the room will be very pleased about that. And their belief in Father Christmas has dropped to about 34%. But still there's this big development. You see, even at 9, the understanding of what's real and what isn't it's still there. It's still up for grabs. And I think what's really important that we have to understand then when we're working with young children, therefore, is that their sense of what reality is very much framed by their environment. And this extends to all sorts of things in their life and their experience. It extends to what we tell them about them. These messages that they learn about themselves, they are reality to them. If it so happens that they're not very reliable, maybe somebody just doesn't like them very much, maybe they're growing up in an unfortunate environment, maybe they've got a big sister who's struggling with jealousy or a big brother who's cross, I don't know. The messages they're getting about themselves are reality because they don't know any different. The messages that they're getting about the world around them are reality. If they have an adult who, say, has a phobia of something, is really scared of them, their version of the world is that thing is utterly terrifying. There is no other version for them where they could say, well, actually, it's just that mum's really scared of it. That's their reality. But their reality on other things is very much up for grabs as well. And we have to understand that when we're working with kids, that as adults we can say, well, obviously, this kid at school is saying these things to you, but clearly they're just stupid. Clearly they're wrong. To us, it's obvious, but to the child, that's reality. If they're getting a message that's saying that they're ugly or that they're different or whatever, then that's part of their real world. So it's a very key thing at this age that their version of what they understand is real is so malleable, it's so determined by what's going on around them. So what happens then to these kids, these little ones, as they then hit the next phase of adolescence, as they start to get a more mature concept of the world? And adolescence is a time of incredible, phenomenal change. But actually, it's about the same as this period of change that my son's in over here. It's just that we expect him to be unpredictable and occasionally difficult and to struggle massively with certain things about the world around him because he's a terrible two. Well, hopefully he's about to stop being one. But these adolescents are in a time of just as much, in terms of their brain development, just as much change, just as much turbulence. And they are trying to make the change from being dependent children who have pretty much everything done for them to being independent, vaguely coherent and successful adults. So it's an even bigger challenge for them. So when you hit adolescence, we've got young people who are outwardly to us often quite difficult, quite hard to understand, quite frustrating. But a lot of that's to do with what's going on in their brains. I'm not excusing their behavior, but I am understanding where it's coming from, particularly in the moments when it gets really hard. And what you tend to see for young people is that they hit periods in their development where they'll have, particularly at the beginning of adolescence, sort of 1 to 6 months zones where they just become incredibly difficult, particularly at this early, I don't know if anyone's got early adolescence at home, but they'll hit these phases where a rapid amount of change is going on and their behavior can change quite dramatically in those periods. And then it settles down for a bit. And then they hit the next phase and it gets more challenging again. Every kid is different in terms of how they respond to this, but there's a lot going on. So I want to look at 5 things that they are experiencing and have a think about what they are. So this is some more brain scans of the brain as it's developing. You can't see the colours that clearly, but you can see the change. And what the message of this scan, this is to do with the level of what's called myelination in the brain, which is to do with how quickly messages travel and how sophisticated the wiring is in your brain, basically. And you can see as it gets darker that it's more what we'd expect an adult brain to look like. So at age 5, at one end, it's quite immature, it's quite childlike. But what you can see here is the development that changes between the ages of about 8 and 16, and even at 20, where you can see that those changes are happening gradually. So the main thing to understand about this age group is how much change is going on, but also just how long that takes. So a child of age 8 has just started that. But actually, and I wouldn't use the word child, but a young person of 19 is still in that zone. Their brain is still developing. They still don't have the same adult ability to cope with certain things or to understand the world in certain ways that they will get when they are, say, 25, 30. Which is good news to those of us who are, at that age and felt like we're, suddenly ancient, because actually your brain is still very young. Those of us who are over that, I'm sorry. It's all downhill from there. But at least your brain is more stable by that stage. What it does mean is that if you hit problems in teenage years, on the whole, as time goes on, things will settle down a bit. Teenage years are very turbulent. They do tend to be quite dramatic times. And we'll talk in a bit about some things that are happening with emotions and stuff, which make emotional problems more likely in this age group. So on the whole, life does settle down. By the time you're 20, 25, life is seeming more under control. But also, you've achieved a lot of the challenges that you had to achieve in that phase, which is about social challenges. So things like moving on, leaving home, hopefully getting a job, that sort of thing. Number 2 is to think about this thing of self-concept. Remember, we've talked about how it starts in these little children, soaking up like a sponge the messages of what the world's telling them about who they are. When they get to adolescence, they start to come out of this egocentric phase, and that can be quite sudden. They suddenly see the world from other people's perspectives. Now, what does that mean for your probably 10, 11-year-old who suddenly had this experience? It means that they suddenly see themselves as other people see them. And this is a massive change for them. So the kid who previously hasn't, you know, with my daughter, it was all I could do to get her to brush her hair in the morning. Getting her in the bath once a week was quite an endeavor. Suddenly, the same child, almost overnight, is doing her hair every morning and getting herself dressed and choosing her clothes. And is actually better done up most days than I am. And we can't get her out of the shower. This is the change because they've suddenly become aware of how they look from other people's perspectives. And so they start to become, they feel this self-consciousness. And as they go on through adolescence, that can become stronger. So they feel almost like the whole time they're walking down the street in a spotlight. They feel suddenly this awareness of everybody else looking at them, of how they seem to other people, and they can become very self-conscious. So again, this is the age where they get embarrassed. My daughter's always complaining, I'm so embarrassed. You're so embarrassing, Mummy. Don't embarrass me. Don't let Nathan embarrass me. You stay over there, and I'll go and talk to my friend. Don't come near me. Because the fear that I might do something that's embarrassing. It's when being the same as everyone else is really important, because they're comparing themselves to everyone else. So this is why it's suddenly so important to have the same shoes or the same, I don't know, loom bands or whatever it is that everybody else has. And you always thought you'd raised your child to be an individual, and then suddenly they hit this phase and they just want to become like every other kid in the world. And it's a bit disheartening. But that's normal. That's part of what they need at that stage to feel comfortable, because they're comparing themselves to everybody else. It's an age where being different is automatically a little bit of a challenge for them. So kids who have maybe a disability that sets them out as different. Kids who have a faith, who go to a school where most of their friends don't, that actually sets them out as being a bit different. And that's a big challenge at this age, because the easiest thing for them is just to be the same as everyone else. And they spend quite a lot of their time in fact-finding and information gathering about what everybody else is doing, so what should they be doing. I was watching this Bake-Off, Sport Relief Bake-Off the other day, and there was that, was it Zoella, is that right, the girl? And I said to her, I was watching with my daughter, I felt like such an idiot, and I was like, she looks just like you, I said. So she's got the same hairstyle, and my daughter's like, yeah, that's because I watch her videos all the time. That's where I learned to do my hair like that. And I was like, oh, of course, because that's what they do. They're looking to find, what should they look like? What should they be doing? What's the right way to be? That's that instinctive understanding that they have that age, of that there is a right way to be, and being different is not that good. When they get a bit older, they get a bit more able to be different again. But at this stage, being the same is quite important. This is the big question that they're asking. They want to know if they're normal. So a challenge to that, being different, is hard. And at their age, being different to everyone else basically equates to, I might not be normal and that might not be a good thing. So they need a lot of reassurance around stuff. You know, it's hard to be the kid who's not very fast at running, or the kid who actually is really good at something that they don't really do that much at school. It's difficult to be the one that stands out at this age. As they get older, so this is more into mid-adolescence, it's the next stage, probably around 12 to 14-ish that they would start to get to this stage. The part of their brain that is devoted to understanding their self-concept begins to develop quite strongly. This is part of their frontal lobes. And they start to get an even more sophisticated idea of who they are. And then they're carrying around in their head lots of different understandings about who they are. So they're understanding, first of all, who they think they are, which is quite vague. They're not really sure. And actually, one of the most common issues that adolescents like to talk about is the fact that they don't know who they are. They feel like they're a different person in different places. So they will worry a lot about this. It's the adolescent identity crisis. But actually, it's totally normal because their concept of who they are has not developed. And part of normal adolescence is about trying out different versions of yourself. So when you have an adolescent of that age and they get up and come down to breakfast every morning, you genuinely don't know which kid you're going to get. On the good days, they're quite pleasant and you feel quite pleased with yourself. You think, I'm not doing a bad job here. On the bad days, you just think, oh my goodness, it's all gone totally wrong. They love anything that their culture gives them that expresses a strong identity. So they're very vulnerable to cultural influences that give identity. So trends like the emo movement, which is a bit less now, but at one point was really strong in this age group because it's all about having a uniform that you wear. You dress in a certain way. It tells you everything. It tells you how to dress. It tells you how to think. It tells you how to feel, what music you should listen to, what magazines you should read. You just take on this self-identity, and it's much easier than trying to figure out actually who you are. They also have this concept of the ideal self. This is who they think they should be. And kids of this age, or teens of this age, I should say, are very vulnerable to media influences. So there's always a lot of debate around things like skinny models in magazines and does that make us all feel bad about ourselves? What the research shows is that this age group are massively affected by that stuff. By the time you're older, an adult, my age, our age, we've all kind of accepted reality. The uncomfortable truth that we're not going to look like that. We are normal adults. We're not the sculpted, airbrushed people that we see in magazines. It doesn't bother us as much. We're still affected by it, but not to the degree that our young people are. Because at their age, all this stuff is still up for grabs. They have this belief that they can and should be able to be all of those things. So I think there's something really interesting around the pursuit for perfection that we're seeing in young people now, which worries me for them. You know, taking selfies, and the fact that the celebrities will take like 200 selfies every day and then publish the best one. And our kids of this age are believing that they should be able to achieve that level of perfection, but they don't understand. We chuckle and we think, how ridiculous, taking 200 photos of yourself and then choosing the best one. But they don't understand that. They just see that one best, and that's how they think they should be all the time. And this belief in the unattainable perfection that they see around them is a real challenge to a child who's still gaining their self-concept, because if you compare what you think you should be to what you are, and there's a huge difference, it can be really hard. So a lot of young people are finding this very, very difficult. There's a third concept they have, which is what the world or the people around them think they should be like. And again, this can be really hard. So if we, as the people around them, don't cut them a little bit of slack, not in how they behave, because, you know, believe me, I'm strict on that, but in terms of how they're understanding the world. So when they behave horrendously and they have tantrums and they say something incredibly rude in the most embarrassing circumstance for you as a parent, of course you tell them off, but we also have to understand that the reason they do that is because they're not adults. 9 times out of 10, my daughter is amazingly good at social stuff. You know, someone gives her a naff present, she smiles very sweetly, she says how lovely it is, it's what she's always wanted. I'll never forget when she was about 5, someone gave her a present and she unwrapped it, and it was a set of cutlery. And she unwrapped it, she looked at it, and she said, well, this isn't a present, which was slightly embarrassing. Now she wouldn't do that. She'd say how wonderful, she loved cutlery, that's just what she wanted. But the 1 time out of 10 when she gets it wrong, it's really wrong, it's really embarrassing. And the temptation for me is to think, well, 9 times out of 10, she's really good. Come on, pull your socks up. Act like an adult. But I have to remember she's only 10. Actually, that 1 time out of 10 is entirely normal. In fact, she's doing really well that it's 9 times out of 10. That's pretty good for her age. I have to cut her a little bit of slack and say, next time maybe you could think about that. But I understand why it's come out wrong. So we need to have this understanding when we're working with them that they are not the finished article yet. And this is a long zone in their life where they're developing and getting this stuff. But self-concept and self-esteem are big issues here. And their vulnerability to some of the messages that the world are giving them is very real. This is really for them also about trying to find their place in an adult world. And what I see a lot of in young people when I'm working one-to-one with them now is that they worry an awful lot about this. Because at the age of 9, 10, they're already getting a lot of messages, a lot of pressures about the adult self that they think they should be. Actually, they've got 8 to 10 years to become that adult self. But at the age of 10, they feel very much like it should be now. They should be getting this stuff sorted now. And at the age of 14, they feel incredible pressure. And at school, at these ages, they're being asked to make decisions about their life that will have an impact on their adult selves. They have no idea. My husband is coming up to 40, and he still isn't sure what he wants to do with his life when he's a grown-up. He still talks about when I'm a grown-up, and I say, I think we're there. I hope we're there. So to a 14-year-old who's suddenly got to decide what they want to be, what course do they want to study, what college do they want to go to, this is really beyond their ability to make those decisions, but they have to try because our culture expects them to. What you also see at this age is their need to express their identity. So in some things, they have to have the ability to have the freedom to express who they are. I find it really interesting comparing our culture here to comparing the culture in France, because in France, their attitude to adolescents is that they give them as much freedom as possible in the things that don't really matter. So on the whole, they very often don't have school uniform. My daughter can do whatever she wants with her hair. She can paint her nails, do whatever she wants in school. That's fine. They are incredibly strict on the things that do matter. But what it means is that the young people, they can express themselves very well in some areas. Here, it's interesting that we tend to be more strict around that stuff, and when my daughter comes back, she's going to find quite a change. She's not going to be allowed to paint her nails. She'll have to wear the school uniform and tie her hair back the way they like it. I think it's interesting that we do tend to see more stuff, therefore, around the rebellion sort of phase where they're trying to express who they are, because we don't let them do that very often. Particularly you guys who work with them in contexts where they've come out of those very controlled environments. We often see them then in their youth clubs, in the evenings and the weekends, going quite wild in terms of expressing who they are. And this is because every instinct that they have at this age is about forming their identity. So it's why you see it so strongly, particularly in your environments, because they've had a lid on it all day, and then they turn up at your session, and they're allowed to relax and be who they are a bit. Understanding, therefore, how they're going to fit into this adult world is something that they're grappling with throughout this phase, and often worrying about it far before they need to. So things like thinking about, if we think about the way their brains are developing and the way that we form relationships, friendships, but also romances as adults, you'll find kids worrying about that from when they're young and doing a lot of experimenting with that stuff, with friendships. This is why kids fall out so much, particularly the girls, because they tend to be a bit more social around these sorts of things. So they're always talking. Picking my daughter up from school is like an episode of The Archers, or of Hollyoaks or something. It's who's fallen out with who's had a row, who is talking to who has said what to who. It takes most of the rest of the evening to understand everything that's just happened in that one day. And this will continue and get worse as she gets older, except she'll probably at some point stop telling me about it because she won't want to talk to me anymore. So I won't hear it, but it'll still be there. This complexity and this experimenting is very normal. And you'll see, for example, quite commonly among this age, there's a lot of talk around these days about sort of same-sex attractions and some of the feelings that go around with that. It's not unusual at all for kids and adolescents to experience a degree of very powerful friendships and relationships that can feel romantic. And that can be a totally normal part of what then becomes part of a sort of what we'd call a heterosexual development. Some of them obviously will go on to then discover that actually it turns into something that is a long-term, lifelong same-sex attraction. But a lot of them, it's just part of their normal development. So we see at this age a normal experimenting, trying out friendships, trying out incredibly powerful close friendships, trying out romances, the early romances that can be so turbulent. But they mean so much because they are so powerful at that age. So we've got to understand what's going on for them. And when we're trying to think about the way they're seeing the world, realize that it isn't an adult world. And what's hard is that as they get older and older, they look more and more adult, don't they? And they have a better social life than you. They can work your phone much better than you can. They understand Facebook and everything on the internet better than you. My daughter has incredible knowledge about all sorts of subjects that I know nothing about. She seems a lot cleverer than me. Sometimes I think she might actually be older than me. But I have to remember that she's only 10. So in other things, there's a lot that I can still teach her, and that she needs to learn from me, and that she'll be learning over the next 8 to 10 years of her life still. We have to remember that. They also live in this incredibly complex social world, which I say none of us, I'm just assuming that everyone's as old as I am, so if you're not, apologies, those of you who are younger. I'm just going to pretend you're not there, if that's helpful, because it just makes me feel old. But we didn't have that. We didn't have email. There wasn't the internet when I was growing up, when I was my daughter's age. However, my daughter lives in this world where it's important for her not just to have a version of herself that is real and physical and out there. She also is already starting to develop this idea that there will be one day a digital self. She's not on Facebook or anything, but some of her friends are at 10. She likes to text people, she likes to look at YouTube and watch the videos. In 4 years' time, she's going to live in this world that is so incredibly complex and that is constant. When I got home from school and shut the door, unless I was allowed to phone my friends, I wouldn't hear from them again till the next morning. She, however, will be in constant and continuous contact with them. And some of that's great. I love social media. I love the vibrancy of it, and I love how dynamic it is, and I love the buzz of it. But at the same time, there are some big and genuine concerns around what that's doing to our young people's brains. And there are actually studies that are demonstrating changes in their physical brain structure. And we have to look at things like the understanding our young people have of concepts like privacy. As adults, we all have a fairly clear idea of where we end and where our private self ends and we become a public self. We all have a concept of how we behave in public and what people understand about us, and we all automatically have that understanding. What we're seeing in young people is they don't really have that because it's basically the same thing. And a lot of them are growing up in worlds where the norm would be to put almost all of your life on display. And what this means is it magnifies everything that they're experiencing. Because when we did something really stupid that's really embarrassing, that let's just never speak about it again, it was maybe witnessed by our family, maybe 2 or 3 friends who happened to be there at the time. Now our kids will find it's on Facebook, and probably someone took a video of it, and if they're unlucky, it might go viral. At an age where they are supposed to be making all kinds of mistakes because they don't really know how to do any of this stuff. So at an age where they should be experimenting and trying things out, they're feeling under an incredible pressure to get it right all the time. And we know as adults we get things wrong, don't we? We all have days where we behave in ways that when we look back, we'd really wish we hadn't. So as a 14-year-old, we should expect that they're going to do that all the time. But we have to understand that it's probably going to be on Facebook. And we have to help them. We have to encourage them to learn some good boundaries, and we have to challenge this stuff with them. But it's hard, isn't it, parents and as youth workers, because the influence of the outside world is always going to be so much bigger than we are. I want to talk number 3 about teenage emotions. This is very important because they are very different to adult emotions. This is a graph I use all the time when I'm working one-to-one with people. So it's a graph here that helps you to draw a little picture of your emotions. You can see up the side there, you've got your scale from 10 at the top, and that's a little smiley face right at the top there. And then it goes down to -10 with a little sad face at the bottom. So what you've got here is you've got 2 zones. There's the happy zone at the top, and then there's the sad zone at the bottom. And we could plot our emotions. I could give you all a copy of this graph now and say, put on the graph where you are right now. So some of you, you're having a great day, you've met some friends who you've not seen for a while, you've had a cup of coffee, you're feeling pretty good. You'd be up the top. Some of you, to be honest, you're a bit bored by the talk, and you didn't get a cup of coffee, and you really rather like one, and so you may be a bit lower down. Maybe you're having a lousy day, you were late, or you overslept, I don't know, maybe you'd be down the bottom. This is a fairly typical adult trace. If I asked any of us to keep a record over a period of days or weeks of our emotions, you see something like this. On the whole, it's in the -1 to 2 zone. Because the reality of adult life is we're quite good at regulating our emotions. If we get low, we tend, on the whole, assuming that we're not struggling with our emotions, we tend to do something about it. We tend not to dip too low or to stay there for too long. But the unfortunate reality of adult life is it takes a lot to get us excited. So when you're a teenager, life is so exciting. But for us, we kind of mosey on around in that middle zone most of the time. Occasionally you might have a really good day, and then it's great because you pop up above that 5 level. But normal is to be roughly around the 0. I often work with people who are having emotional health problems, and they think that normal should be being in the 8 to 10 zone the whole time. So it's very interesting to say to people, actually, I'm really sorry, but life just isn't like that. And you hit phases in life where things actually can be hard. Maybe you just had a new baby or something and you feel like you're spending most of your time just trying to stay as close to zero as you can because you're exhausted and it's just hard work. Or maybe you started a new job or you've had a bereavement or something and just keeping your head above water is hard. That's normal adult emotional life. But we're fairly stable unless the really big stuff is going on. Would you like to see a typical teenage trace? That's pretty typical of the kids that I work with, the teenagers I work with. And a huge number of teenagers these days, they come to see me and they say, I'm bipolar. They will say, I'm pretty sure I'm bipolar, because a lot of the celebrities are. It's quite a trendy thing to be these days. And so we'll have a chat and we'll draw a trace like this, and I will say, I can see how you mean that. I can see what you're feeling. You're experiencing these extreme highs followed by extreme lows. They're quite unpredictable. You can move from very high to very low with very little trigger. It can happen very quickly. I wouldn't experience that as an adult. But then what I say to them is, that's totally normal. If you're 14, this is a pretty normal emotional trace for you. Life at 14 is like this. It's all about the big dramas. So if we think about life as trying to get your boat across an ocean, as an adult, it's usually pretty calm. And if there's a storm coming, we can see it generally. We feel fairly empowered to steer around it, to cope fairly well with it. Life as a teenager is about constantly bailing out water. The waves can hit from any direction at any time. They often say to me that they feel like they've got no control at all. So it's like there's nothing you can do about it. Waves just hit you at times because your emotions are much more raw. They're much more reactive. And the part of your brain that is controlling, particularly those social emotions, is still developing. So when they hit this phase where they are experimenting with romance and friendships, you'll see things like jealousy and anger and frustration and sadness and real tears and really hard feelings become pretty normal. And so for your teen to be crying and saying they don't know why they feel so awful, it can be quite frightening as an adult to hear that, but actually it's pretty normal for a teenager to have spells like this and to say, look, sometimes you will feel that's okay. And what our job is as adults is to help them cope with those moments and start to learn what is adult emotional control, which is that when you feel rough, what do? You look after yourself, you self-nurture, or you do something that will help you to feel better or whatever. But we need to understand that they will be experiencing these emotions. It's why this merges into my point number 4, which is that teenagers are so vulnerable to stuff that is not that positive a way of dealing with their emotions. So the things that we all might do as well sometimes as adults, using alcohol if you've had a rough day, using caffeine to help you feel a bit more perky, and other things that teenagers might do like drug culture and things like that, they are much more prone to them because their emotions feel really out of control. And if you feel like you can't control your emotions, you're much more likely to turn to something external to you that helps you to feel a bit better. It's also because, and this is my point number 4, their brains are, in biological terms, more reactive to these things. So things like alcohol, drugs, caffeine have been shown to have a much bigger impact on teenage brains. So you know how good you feel after your first coffee of the day? Times that by like 10, and that's how good caffeine is to your kids, which is why you can't get them off the Red Bull or the Coke or whatever it is that they're drinking. And a lot of kids these days drink a lot of caffeine. And as psychologists, that's something that we would pick up very quickly on because the impact it can have on their behavior and their ability to focus attention, their ability to impulse control, all the things that are good for us as adults because we need to push those things up a bit. For teenagers who are already finding those things hard, dosing themselves up on caffeine is not going to be a good move. It also impacts things like their sleep, which we'll talk about a bit later, which again make life harder for them. So they're very prone to these things. And the fifth thing, the last thing of my set of 5 for teenagers that they're very prone to is risk-taking. One of the key things about their brain, one of the last things to develop is the ability to link something that I do now with the impact it'll have in the future. So whether that's studying tonight for the exam I've got tomorrow, whether it's the reason that I don't sleep with the guy who I've just met when I've had quite a few drinks too many, because later on it might cause me a problem, Whether it's why smoking a lot of dope now might have a big impact on my future, they don't care, because they genuinely don't think like that. They find it very hard to link cause and effect when there's a delay. And this develops right into your 20s. I don't know if there's any people in your 20s still here, but we've discovered recently through studies that actually even people in their early 20s are still not showing an adult level of activity in the bit of the brain that does this. So it's why motivation is much harder for teenagers, getting themselves out of bed, not being late to school. But right down to the more serious end of risk-taking, they're not very good at thinking things through. And again, I know there's lots of adults who aren't very good at thinking things through and thinking long-term, but young people really struggle with it. We can help them. We can make it much more concrete. We can sit down with pieces of paper and say, okay, let's think. If you carry on the way you are now, let's think about where you will be in 5 years' time. What will that look like? Is it good? Is it bad? These are the sorts of things we can do as adults to help them both to learn but also to get around the shortcomings of their brains at the moment they're in. What we're talking about for teenagers is the need for us to help them to be what I would call emotionally resilient. Teenage life is genuinely really challenging. And if you think about the level that we're seeing of emotional ill health in teenagers and young people these days in this country, it is huge. 1 in 10 teenagers could be diagnosed with a serious depressive disorder. 2 in 10 girls would say they regularly feel seriously anxious or depressed. There's so many stats I could have told you. Between 10 and 25% of teenagers have self-harmed at least once. In some schools, they're seeing rates as well over half of the kids in their classes are self-harming. These are all things that kids do when they're struggling with their emotions, either to help them to try to feel better or to help them cope in the really rough moments. Eating disorders, around a quarter of girls and ever-increasing levels of boys, as they're struggling with all these messages about perfection, this is something that a lot of them are struggling with now. And what you see here is an age where a lot of young people they're hitting emotional health problems. And we can say, on the one hand, that's a problem for the ones who develop serious problems. So a small proportion of those are going to end up with serious enough emotional health problems that they have to get treated. Some of them might even end up having to go into inpatient treatment for some of these things, the eating disorders, the self-harm, the serious depression. But there's another even bigger cohort of them who are just going to be struggling with these issues. And if they go into adult life still not having learned how to deal with their emotions well, if they go into adult life the only way, knowing the only one way to deal with their emotions, which is to drink more or to smoke more or whatever it is they do, what we're going to have is a group of adults, a population of adults in the next generation who will have had to let go of a lot of their dreams because they will be limited in their potential. They'll be limited in what they can do in their life, in what they can achieve, not by their ability, not by any academic thing, but by how they cope with stuff. I see a lot more adults now who have hit problems in their life because of things like how do they deal with stress, how do they manage anxiety, things like they don't sleep well, they struggle very much with depression or things like that. I see a lot more people limited by that than I see people who didn't get enough A's at A-level. So we have a generation and another generation coming behind who have got a reasonable chance of struggling with this stuff. And our role, our opportunity, and our responsibility is to help them to overcome some of this stuff. It's a bit daunting. But the good news is we weren't meant to do it alone. As a parent, I'm a psychologist. I do this stuff day in, day out. I work with kids who really struggle with this stuff. As a parent, I can tell you when it's your own kid, it's really hard. It's a lot harder dealing with the normal ups and downs of life with your own children than it is as a professional. I much prefer coming in as a professional. Apart from everything else, they can moan about their parents to me. When mine moan about their parents, it feels a bit more personal somehow. But we were never meant to do this alone. Kids were never designed to be raised just by 2 people or just by 1 people. A lot of people are doing it literally just on their own. That's why the community that our kids grew up in is so important. It's why school is so important. And it's why as youth workers, you guys have such a fantastic position. When I get referred a young person who's struggling, one of the first questions I will ask is, who else is there in this kid's life who's an adult who is supporting them? Is there anyone who isn't a parent? Because I know as a professional, but also as a parent, that those people are probably in a better position to help them with a lot of this stuff than the parents are. We're too involved as parents. We're in the boat. We can't rock it. We can't deal with the storms that's hitting it. As an outsider, you have a much better chance of being able to help people if they've hit problems. So this is my first 5 to run through, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of time for some questions. But What can we do then to help these young people? 5 practical things. Here's number 1. This is about consistency. And in our world, we love consistency. Now, this is why coffee shops are so popular, because we love the fact that in theory, if we go into Costa or Starbucks or wherever in Paris, we should get the same drink that we get in Crewe or wherever we are. It's consistency. If you go in the next day, you should get the same drink. If you go in and you order your latte with extra foam or whatever it is, you should get the same drink every day. That's why it works, because we love consistency and we love the idea that we get the same thing. It doesn't work because if you go to France, they don't like you being fussy. So they say things like, you don't want cream on your latte, but it comes with cream. Anyway, that's a whole aside. But that's what it's supposed to work like that. The French don't like individuality very much. They like you to conform. Anyway, what this is about as adults is that we can provide that consistency for young people. You guys have an amazing opportunity to provide consistency, particularly for those who, for whatever reason, haven't got that at home. I know as a parent, sometimes things happen in family life that we cannot control. We want to. We want to be able to make everything as perfect for our kids as possible, but sometimes stuff happens and we can't control it at home. Like I say, maybe someone's ill, maybe a marriage has split up. Who knows? Stuff happens. But you as an outside group can provide a consistency, a safe space which is always there where the kids can come to, where they know what they're going to get. They know the adults there are going to be consistent, and they know that the adults there are about them, they're supporting them, they're for them. You can help them learn about relationships. It's all about relationships at this stage. Not a parent-child relationship, which is automatically so loaded. It's a great thing. It's wonderful. Parenting is so important. But our kids need other relationships. My kids need other relationships to practice with. They need adults who will bear with them when they behave like complete mad people, and will still be there for them the next time when they've said the ridiculously insulting thing. Because they're trying it out, they're going to get it wrong. They need people who will teach them about what to do when things have gone wrong in their friendships, the stuff that they won't talk to me about because I'm their mum, and it's just, that's the way of it. As they get older, part of their natural development is separating from me as their mum, so they won't come to me with all their problems. Hopefully they'll come to me with the big ones, but a lot of them they'll need to bring to you guys because they have to have somewhere else to go with that stuff as they're learning to be adults. You can help them with their friendships, with their social media stuff, with the practical things, the sensible limits that they need to put on things, how to handle things when it's gone wrong. Hopefully you might know more than they do about their privacy settings on Facebook, but only if you've sat down and read that very, very long document, which nobody ever reads. But it's good. Seriously, we need to get good at this stuff because we have to support our young people. And the challenge to us as adults is to keep ahead of them. Believe me, it's a challenge. The amount of conversations I've had with my daughter where I've become painfully aware that she has sprinted ahead of me on a topic or her understanding on something. I'm way behind. I've got to get faster. I have to keep up with her better because I need to stay one step ahead of her so I can support her. Otherwise, she's experiencing stuff and going out there and dealing with stuff that I'm not understanding enough about. As youth workers, we have an even bigger responsibility to try and be ahead of them. We can help them with romantic relationships. We can model some of that stuff in our own marriages, in our own spaces, because maybe they're not getting that at home. Maybe they've had an experience at home where a marriage has broken up or there's been domestic abuse or violence in the home. We are another opportunity they have to learn about that stuff and to learn good messages. In school, they will get a load of messages about love and sex and relationships that are not the ones that I, as a parent, want to give them. They will listen to me, but only so far. They'll listen to you a bit further because you're generally more cool than I am as a parent. As a parent, even if you actually are pretty cool, or this is what I tell myself, at a certain age, you cease to become cool to your kids. I tell myself it's just their perspective, but, you know, as youth workers, I think you keep going a bit longer, mostly. Certainly my daughter thinks her youth workers are just amazing people, the other people who aren't her parents. So you can use that, you can teach them, you can influence them, you can tell them stuff, you can help them navigate some of this stuff around the really difficult things where their culture is giving them really strong messages. You can draw clear boundaries for them, number 2. Kids and young people spend their entire life challenging boundaries, but you know what? They need them and they want them. You can help them to have a healthy level of control. Kids, particularly young kids, they act like what they want is to be in control of the whole world. But when I see a kid who comes into my room who is in control of their whole world, I know I'm going to be dealing with an emotionally very vulnerable child, because that's not the way it's supposed to be. They are not supposed to be in control. They instinctively try to be in control, but they shouldn't be. Our job is to limit things for them, to be in control, because their emotions are powerful, they're unpredictable, they're not good at coping with risk, they're not good at making decisions. And we know that for the 3-year-olds. No one would ever send my son out into the world and expect him to navigate it without adult help. But actually, my 10-year-old still needs a lot of that help. She still needs the strict boundaries. So does the 14-year-old, although by then you're having to tread the balance between letting them have freedom and giving them appropriate boundaries. But keeping an appropriate level of control is important, whether they're in your group or whether they're in your home. We have to let them make some bad decisions, because that's what life is about. But we have to protect them from the really bad decisions, because they have the potential to make really, really bad decisions. Look at these 3 girls who've just gone off to Syria. You just think, oh my goodness, that's the sort of thing that they will do at that age, because they're not capable of thinking it through. And just look at how badly they can get it wrong. We have to protect them as much as we can, and we can't always do it, but we have to do the best we can to protect them from the really bad decisions. But we have to let them make some of the less bad decisions, because that's the only way they'll learn. We have to help them learn how to navigate the turbulence that is their emotions. So they are whitewater rafting most of the time with their emotions, and we have to help them to learn good, healthy ways of controlling that. We have to model good stuff in how we deal with our own emotions, and we have to verbalize that stuff. We have to help them get a vocabulary about emotions and what they are and how they feel and how you deal with them. If all we do is bottle it up and hide it, and then turn to drink or whatever it is, that's all they'll ever learn from us. If we can teach them good ways and positive ways of dealing with our emotions, that's better. You know, so often, particularly in our British culture, we feel like our job as adults is to hide our emotions. Actually, I would say to you, it's good to be open with your kids about your emotions. We worry a lot, like, should our kids see us cry? Yes, they should, because it's a normal human emotion, and they mustn't be scared of it. They need to know how to deal with it if you've had a lousy day and you're feeling a bit tearful. They need to see you doing something positive in order to get out of that, and they need to learn good ways of dealing with it. So helping them to navigate this stuff is important. They are literally fighting fires with their emotions. Adult emotions are like striking a match. They're small and manageable. Teenage emotions, they strike a match and whoomph, this whole bonfire goes up. So we have to help them to put some of those fires out sometime. We have to help calm them down when they're in the heat of it. But we also have to give them good strategies to try and stop it flaring up every time. We've got to help them name their emotions, you know. We have to help them to understand what they all are and get a better sense of what emotions are and how normal they are. You know, it's not normal to be in the top 8 to 10 on that graph every day. We have to teach them how you manage in the days when you're actually at -1 or -2 or -5. What do you do when life throws really tough stuff at you? Number 4, we have to give them opportunities to shine, because part of their self-esteem and self-concept development relies on them having these moments. But a lot of young people, particularly if they've grown up in rougher circumstances, they never get this chance. So the kid who, age 3, has learned that the only way to get consistency and the only way to get adult attention is to misbehave. At the age of 3, he's become the problem child. I say he, it's usually boys, but not always. It's become the problem child, the naughty boy, the difficult child. If that kid grows up the rest of their life with that label, that's the only label they will ever get, is a negative one. And that's what they'll behave to fulfill, because that's reality to them. Remember, at that age, that's real. We have to give our kids chances to be what we want them to be and what we know they are. Amazing, unique, fantastic, inspiring people who can do incredible things with the rest of their lives. They don't know that. They don't know how amazing they are. We have to teach them, and one of the best ways we can teach them is by giving them opportunities to be those people. So our youth group in our church, one of the things they do each year is they have this talent contest. What I love about it is that kids get up in that talent contest, and some of them are amazing. They've got real skills and they've had lessons or whatever. Some of the kids from the rougher places haven't had the chance to do this, but they get up and they do their best, and everyone goes crazy. They cheer and they love it, and they just give it because we think they're amazing. They've got a chance to shine. Some of those kids don't have that chance anywhere else in their life, and they need it to be healthy. We should never be labeling the young people we're with. If they have a genuine condition, then they get diagnosed with it and we help them. Maybe they've got something like ADHD or they're on the autistic spectrum. Those labels can be good because they help them access genuine help. But they can also be powerfully negative because then this kid becomes the one who is never going to be able to engage with whatever it is we're doing. They're always going to be the one who's not going to get a job or who's going to struggle with their behavior or whatever. We mustn't slip into just going along with those labels. We must always give our kids the chance and our young people the chance to be amazing because that's what they are. Some of them, it's just more challenging to find it. You just have to look hard sometimes. And then the fifth thing, which might seem like a weird one, is that we have to teach our kids how to sleep. This is a little bit of a personal bugbear of mine, so I'm going to end on it because, but do you know there are studies that show that if you rate the quality of children and young people's sleep, and then you measure it alongside things like behavioral problems, problems with depression, problems with stress, problems with anxiety, all the negative stuff, the kids who sleep better have lower issues with those problems. As children, it's probably the number one thing that as parents we struggle with, teaching our kids to sleep. And parents need more help with that because it's important. But as teenagers, they have so much stuff that's stopping them from sleeping. And as adults, we're bad enough at doing this. We burn the candle from both ends. We think we're super people. We're not. You need sleep. Most of us need to sleep a lot more than we do, particularly those of us with young children. Bad luck about that. It gets better. But we need to sleep more. And our kids, our teenagers, there is, for example, a lot of research now showing that backlit devices like iPhones, iPads, laptops, the light shining on your retina connects with the cells at the back of your retina that control your sleep-wake cycle. So if your kids are sitting usually in dark rooms looking at devices, which they do, my daughter does it too, they will actually interfere with their biological regulation for their sleep, and they will find it hard to get to sleep. So we have to help them not do this, and we have to put some boundaries around it. We as adults have to model it. I know the last thing you do before you go to sleep, have your phone out. You're all going to deny it now, but I know that most of us do it. I do it, and I talk about this. So now I try and put it down half an hour before I go to sleep. Do not read your email. You don't need to. There's nothing so urgent it can't wait till tomorrow. But our kids will be texting and messaging and stuff. We also need to teach them about how to have downtime. Do you know how few kids I work with know what relaxation is? And most of them would call it wasting time. But actually, there's a whole other talk I could give about humans, how as humans we were designed with a need to have downtime, me time, relaxation time. You work 6 days, then you rest the 7th. I'm going to talk about that a bit in the second session for those of you who come along. We are designed to need the work, rest, balance, and our kids aren't doing it. Why? Because when they're not studying at school, they're doing things that they think are chilling out, but they're not. Texting your friends is not chilling out. The bit of your brain that's dealing with the social interaction is buzzing then. We need to have some time when it's not buzzing. They have to learn to relax. They have to learn to have times when their brains are not being bombarded by information. And again, that will interfere with their ability to sleep. They won't sleep well. So the teenage years are a time where there's a massive change. The childhood years are also times of change, but we expect that. What's our job? It's to support them through it. And it's to give them the skills that they need to develop a good adult emotional resilience. And I've talked about lots of negative stuff here, but to give the positive, you all work with young people. I love young people. Do you like working with young people? Yeah. That's good, because, your youth workers, I'd be worried if you said no, that would be bad. But they're so much fun, they're so dynamic. And no matter how bad it gets with young people, everything is still up for grabs. I can work with a young person who's so unwell, but I know that they can get well and they can get the whole of their life back. And some teenagers, it goes really bad before they start to pull out of it and go into, good adult life. It's a time of natural change. We can take advantage of that because we can teach them so much. So be inspired by what you can do. You're seeing so much more emotional ill health stuff than you used to, I'm guessing. And that is alarming, but you still have the opportunity to do so much good with these young people. And you may well be the person that can make a difference for one young person between being able to manage and go on and be successful and reach their potential, or between struggling for the rest of their life with things. So be inspired by that opportunity. You're in great positions. I'm just going to finish with telling you about a couple of websites. So this is the Mind and Soul website. We're mindandsoul.info.
You can also follow us. We're at mindandsoul.uk, or my Twitter thing was on the slide at the beginning. I'll put it back on, or I'll get the guys to put my first slide back up in a bit, which has got my Twitter thing. And do tweet, do chat about this stuff. There's loads of articles and resources as well on the Mind and Soul website about emotional health and about the challenges of dealing with that, but also about teaching good emotional health and how to do that. This is another website that we've just brought out, which is the Mental Health Access Pack, which is mentalhealthaccesspack.org.uk. This is about helping the church if you're dealing with mental health issues. So if you are got young people who are struggling with eating disorders or self-harm or depression, things like that, there's loads of good information on there. You can read resources and find out how to deal with it. There's also things like there's a guide on there for how to deal with CAMS, which is Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. So those of you who've got young people who've been referred there, there's some great practical advice on there. And I'm around. I think it's coffee break time. Who has the time? Yeah. So if you want to come and chat to me, I'm going to be around through the coffee break. And then when do the next sessions start? Yeah, so you've got a bit of coffee time or question time. Thank you.